So our next talk is on climate change. Why should we care? And this is by Hugh Rollinson, the course director here at the Faraday Institute. And Hugh is also an emeritus professor of earth sciences at the University of Derby. Now, Hugh's had an interesting career where he's been all over the world. So he's worked in Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Oman at different universities, as well as a stint at the University of Gloucestershire. And his academic interests are on the Earth history, geochemistry, and right now he's going to apply that expertise to the question of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. Well, you might be asking, why does an Earth scientist want to talk about climate change? So maybe just a word of preface. In the Earth sciences, in the last 2 or 3 decades, we've increasingly realized that we cannot just consider the solid Earth. We need to think about the Earth system. So we tend now to think about rocks together with the oceans, the atmosphere, and the biosphere. And in my work on the early Earth, these things tend to come very much together. So what I'm going to reflect in this talk is an approach that we now use in the earth sciences applied to the modern. And as you will see, and as I'm sure you already know, climate change is an extremely important example of where different parts of the earth system interact with each other. As you also know, this is a hugely topical subject. If we just go back a few years, we have had the Paris Climate Agreement. In 2018, October, just a few months ago, we had the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change reporting their most recent report, and I'll say a little bit about that, a report that was commissioned at the Paris meeting. And then you may remember in the news in December, there was a meeting in Katowice in Poland where the IPCC report of October was due to be ratified. And if you remember, it was a very extensive meeting that ran over in terms of time. This was the 24th Conference of Parties that had been meeting since the 1990s to progress United Nations agreements about climate change. But I want to start by talking to you about a book which has changed me, and we can probably all reflect on books that have done that to us in different areas of our life. Jeremy Legger was a postgraduate student when I was an undergraduate, and so when I read a review in a geological magazine of this book that he published in the late 90s, immediately the name rang a bell. He'd gone on from his postgraduate work to become a lecturer at Imperial College working with the oil industry, and then after 10 years he completely turned around, as it were, and began to work for Greenpeace, and he is now a climate lobbyist. But what he told in this narrative style book is the story leading up to the climate conference in Kyoto in 1997, when the first agreements were made about what we should do as nations about climate change. But the bit that gripped me and the bit that I found persuasive and powerful was the way in which he tells his story. He's talking about a war, and he describes 2 warring factions. He describes those who belong to what he called the Carbon Club. In other words, anybody who has a link with carbon-based fuels, so the motor industry, the oil industry, the coal industry, and some key governments whose economy was very much driven by oil. And then, in contrast, he talks about the good guys, the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel, the small island nations, Pacific nations whose coral atoll islands are in danger of being flooded with sea level rise, and a number of other lobbying groups, such as the one he was working for at the time. And what I came to realize was that this business of climate change, which I would tend to think of in scientific terms, is much more than that. It is hugely political, and it is political driven by vested interests. And he's continued to write books and lobby in this field up until the present day. He's got a very good blog site if you want to look him up. And he continues to tell the story of how powerful vested interests are shaping the way in which the world understands climate change and shapes the ways in which decisions are being made, or we should probably say the lack of decision is being made. So I've got two aims in this talk. I want to try and persuade you that climate change is real, that it matters, it is urgent, and because of what I've just said, it is a moral issue. And further, to explore with you the way in which our Christian theology might govern how we view climate change. It leaves open the question, what should we do? I'm not going to attempt to answer that. We can look at that another time informally if you wish. So 4 areas of my talk. I want to briefly look at the science of climate change, briefly look at the impacts, consider the urgency, and then, if you will allow me, to develop what I would consider a theology for climate change. So, here's the science. Pretty simple, really. We've got the sun's rays shining on our planet, the Earth. And what happens is, as indicated down here, I'll read it to you, it says about half the solar radiation is absorbed by the Earth's surface and it warms it. So a lot of this solar energy comes to the rocks and soils of our planet and they get warm. And then that turns into thermal energy, which is then released from the Earth back into the atmosphere. And some of that thermal energy escapes, but quite a lot of it stays trapped by particular molecules in the atmosphere, molecules that relate to greenhouse gases. And I don't know whether Keith is here at the moment. Yes, Keith is here. And so, Keith, I may contest with you which is the most important molecule in the universe, and I might suggest that carbon dioxide is the most important molecule in the universe, a somewhat simpler molecule than the one that you were talking to us about. So what happens is that these molecules get energized by this thermal energy, and that leads to a slow but gradual warming of the atmosphere. And the one we all know about is carbon dioxide, but we have these other greenhouse gases present as well. And so measurements have been made of the concentrations of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, in this very exciting location, Mauna Loa, which is on Hawaii. Nice work if you can get it. And scientists have been measuring the levels in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since 1958 up until the present day. And as you can see, there's a seasonal variation, but the curve has shown a progressive growth from around 300, these units are parts per million, 300 parts per million, now exceeding 400 parts per million. And measurements tend to be made relative to what we call the pre-industrial level, which is the 1800s, before factories started belching out lots of smoke and so on. And that pre-industrial level is often held at about 280. So what we are seeing here then is the rise in carbon dioxide levels in the Earth's atmosphere in a clean environment. That's why Hawaii is used, because we're in the middle of an ocean. There's no pollution from industrial activities, and how those levels have risen over the last 60 years, actually quite dramatically. And recently they passed the 400 part per million level. And then we see the way in which global temperature has followed a similar curve. Now note the scale is not the same here. We're back at 1860 here. So we're back at, if you like, the pre-industrial level, which on this scale is set at 0 degrees. And we see how the early part of the 20th century, the values in temperature began to climb, and then most recently have climbed more rapidly in the last 2 or 3 decades. And some people, if you know Al Gore's film, refers to this as the hockey stick curve because of the sharp increase in the shape of the curve as we have gone on with time. And now we've got some projections for what global temperature is going to do in the next decade or so. And notice that at the present time, we have exceeded 1 degree of global warming above the pre-industrial level. And this increase correlates directly with the increase in carbon dioxide, which is the main global warming gas. So that red arrow shows where the two curves connect. So if we just go back a bit further in time, these are now carbon dioxide levels from the year 1000, so set at the pre-industrial level, 280 parts per million, and then rapidly rising in industrial times. And interestingly, this is the curve for methane, which is showing the same thing. Now, it's just worth pointing out that methane is an important global warming gas in the sense that it has something like 20 times the power of carbon dioxide in terms of its global warming effect. But it's there in very small proportions, and also it's very short-lived. It reacts with other gases in the atmosphere and disappears after about 10 or 12 years. But if we go back even further in time, this squiggly curve obtained from ice core measurements shows us that back to 800,000 years, the levels have never risen above 300 parts per million. So what we're seeing today is really quite extraordinary. And so the correlation between rising carbon dioxide levels, so the burning of carbon-based fuels, in other words, and global temperature, in many people's minds, is very, very firmly established. If we look now at the impacts, I just want to illustrate this with an example that I myself was privy to, if that's the right word. This overlaps a little bit with what Roger was saying to us earlier. In the 2000s, I lived in the Middle East, and this is Cyclone Gonu, which hit Muscat, there's Muscat, in 2007, in the summer of 2007. And so I just want to show you some of the photographs of what happened in that city. That was the Toyota garage after the cyclone had passed. That was the coast road that we would drive up and down on. That was the church that I used to go to, well, did go to when I was there. That was just an unfortunately parked car which got drawn in by, I think, solifluction. And that was a local filling station. And so we fairly quickly get the idea that when climate change events happen, the impacts are pretty catastrophic. And in many ways, this was a very mild event. And I can't say for sure that this was climate change driven, but it's just usefully illustrative. But people are arguing, and now I'm looking at recent literature, people are arguing that the effects of climate change are getting more extreme. And one of the principal ways of understanding this is really very simple. If we're warming the Earth, we're warming the oceans. And if we're warming the oceans, we are evaporating more water. There's more water in the atmosphere, and therefore there are consequences. There's going to be higher rainfall, or, if you like, more extreme rainfall events, which will lead to flooding, which often leads to landslides. And there is also a good case to be made that there is increased number and an increased intensity of storms, hurricanes, and cyclones. The other thing, of course, that's happening is that the ice in glaciers and in ice caps is melting. So we've got consequent sea level rise and potential flooding of coastal cities, ocean islands, deltas. And this leads in turn to a balance in terms of the relative amounts of fresh water feeding into the ocean. It's greatly increased, and that has the potential to change the ocean circulation. And if you remember the film The Day After Tomorrow, when there was a big freeze, was all about the switching off of the North Atlantic conveyor because fresh water was upsetting the saline circulatory system. Ultimately, these changes will lead to a change in the distribution of resources on the Earth, so there is potential to affect things like food security, human health, the potential for migration, displacement, and conflict. And looking at the IPCC report that came out in 2018, they list a huge number of potential impacts which are going to happen as a consequence of climate change. But one point that's worth making is that some of these changes will have a disproportionate impact on poor people. So things like water availability, too much or too little, flooding, storms, sea level rise, food security, human health, migration and displacement and related conflict are all effects of climate change that are going to affect the poor nations disproportionately. That we in our Western society can mitigate against quite a lot of this, but there are certain parts of the world where people are becoming increasingly vulnerable. Just a word about climate change and the urgency of climate change, because what happened with the Paris Agreement is that the threshold for dangerous things happening was reduced from 2 degrees warming to 1.5 degrees warming. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But if you go back to the climate change agreements of the 1990s, we were looking at 2 degrees as the tipping point, as they say. This is the point at which things begin to get really bad. In Paris, and subsequently in the commissioned IPCC report, and then the Poland conference in December, the discussion was all about a 1.5 degree threshold. This is in order to minimize risk, and they argued in the report that the risks posed by global warming at 1.5 degree are far greater than for the present day, but not as disastrous as 2 degrees. Now in this, we need to remember that my graph earlier that I showed you of current global warming trends is that we are already above 1 degree above the pre-industrial level. So this 400 and whatever we're at now, 20 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, compared with the pre-industrial 280, has given us over 1 degree. And this is why things are so urgent. There are huge financial implications for global warming in all sorts of ways. I mean, it may well be that in years to come we will not be able to get house insurance, let's say, because the risk, the financial risk, the financial sector will reckon that there are too many events happening which make it not financially viable. So these are the things that came out of the Paris 2015 agreement that have now been ratified in Poland in 2018. But let me just take you to some of the recent science that has been done on this. And so there's a couple of journals that I've tended to look at. One is Nature, one of the premier scientific journals, and the other is Nature Geoscience, which is a parent of that, publisher. And in this particular article, I can't see the date now, but it was very recent, it was last year, they're arguing that the time that will be taken to get to 1.5 degrees warming is of the order of 22 years, plus or minus 10, based on current warming rates. And this very complicated diagram from their paper basically makes the same point. This black area here is showing the range of possibilities from different climate models. And this is calibrated against a series of curves which read 99 years, 49 years. So we've got a range here, 33 years down to about 19 years here. And this gives them their 22 plus or minus 10. So what we are saying is that stuff is going to happen that is going to be calamitous, perhaps in our own lifetime and certainly in the lifetime of our children. There is basically a generation before these things kick in big time. Here's another article. This was more of a newsy article in Nature, published in December 2018. Again, warning us that global climate change is happening much more quickly than we have perhaps realised. And so here's another graph which shows us that this was the projected curve, and effectively, because of inaction, there's a big error bar there that you can't see very well, but if you just follow the red curve with your eye, it's basically showing that the projected curve from the governmental climate change report is projecting change by 2040, I think it is, and it's saying at present warming rates, because basically we're not doing anything about climate change globally, the warming rates indicate that things are going to happen by 2030. So this is a summary of what they said in that article, that there are three things that are going to happen. Emissions will continue to rise, the quality of air pollution in many places will decrease, and if you combine that with natural climate cycles, over the next 20 years it's going to make climate change faster and more furious. And if this is a field that's not very familiar to you, one of the things you need to know is that there are certain positive feedbacks in this process. So as the Earth gets warmer, it becomes a kind of runaway effect. So various things kick in, like frozen land begins to warm up and melt, and that then releases gases which exacerbate the person. So there's this positive feedback loop in the climate system that means that things eventually end up with a kind of runaway climate system. And interestingly, this is a complete digression, planet Venus, with a temperature of about 400 to 500 degrees, is a runaway climate system. But that's not the scenario we are going to see on Earth. We're different planets. But it gives you some idea of what a runaway climate might do ultimately. So the authors of this paper are saying there's a good chance we could breach the 1.5 degrees level by 2030, not 2040, as projected. So, on to climate change theology, and I just want to spend a few minutes now with a few thoughts on how we might think about climate change with a biblical Christian perspective. And first of all, I want to make a point that's already been made today about the nature of the goodness of God's creation. Clearly, this has to be a starting point for any Christian theology about the natural world. So I would want to say that there are people who would argue that the material world is fundamentally evil and a world that we therefore need to be liberated from, a world that we'd be happy to discard, to leave behind, to go to a new and better place. Now, that is not, as I understand it, Orthodox Christian teaching. It's not the teaching of the Bible. As I read it, God's creation is ordered, God's creation is good, it has value, and if I might add, God's creation has an enduring goodness, even after the fall. So there's something inherently good about the nature of what God has made. And interestingly, and again this point has been made I think already today, at Christmas time I was just reflecting on the nature of the incarnation and what it means, and I think perhaps for the first time it hit me that in the context of this area of reasoning, what God is doing in the incarnation is reaffirming the fundamental goodness of the created order. God took a woman and she was the one who brought a child into the world, and that child was one who took on human form. And so you could see that as a fundamental reaffirmation of the created order. The second point I want to draw on, again this is not novel, is the fact that our attitude towards the natural world has to be one of stewardship. And again, this has been mentioned already today. So to make the point that creation belongs not to us to use or abuse as we wish, but creation belongs to God. And as we read in the Old Testament, we find this quite clearly stated, that the land is the object of God's tender care and gifted to human society. And so there's a lot in the Old Testament about the care for the land so that it has a sustainable life. We have a moral responsibility for all of life, not just human life. And our human vocation, therefore, is to care for the place which God has put us in, the stewardship of his creation. But at this point, I want to slightly move away from, if you like, orthodoxy, or if you like, much of what has been taught as orthodoxy, and suggest that if we are thinking simply about stewardship, and you can debate this with me at the end, I'm going to try and persuade you that stewardship implies duty. And is that what drives us? Is that what drives our people in our churches? Do they simply live their life for God out of duty? Do they come to church? Do they fulfill their church offices out of duty? I would like to suggest that there's actually something more that will drive us in our thinking about the natural world and about creation. I want to take us to the resurrection and think about the resurrection as a new beginning. To argue that the resurrection is the inauguration of God's new kingdom, if you like, God's new world order of which we are part, and within which climate change is happening. So what I'm trying to persuade you is that rather than think about these things from a duty perspective, I'm sorry that's not very easy to read, I've written passion, excitement. What I'm trying to get across is the idea that our motivation for thinking about the created world and thinking about climate change should be one that is driven by passion and excitement because of our theology of the resurrection. Some unattributed quotes. I think this one is Michael Northcott, who writes, "The resurrection is the pivotal doctrine of Christianity in relation to the Hebrew understanding of the created order. It's God's vindication of his creation and created life. It reaffirms the fundamental goodness and harmony of the created order. It's the resurrection where we see the key to the transforming and the redeeming of alienated humanity from the fall. The redemption, if you like, or the restoration of relationships between God and humanity, between persons, between humans and non-humans, between non-humans themselves, by the restoration of the created order. So what I'm trying to persuade you of, if we think in New Testament terms about the resurrection, we are living in God's new order, and that should be a driver which helps us think about the way we treat climate and climate change and the world in which we live. If I might go on, this is N.T. Wright, I think. God's saving purpose is not to rescue people out of his world, but to renew creation itself. Jesus is not the one who rescues us from creation, but one who rescues creation. And so I guess if this is our mindset, if this were our theology, this would be the driver for seeing that climate change and the way in which it's wrecking our planet and wrecking human society should be one of paramount importance to us. And again, the judgment is not the demolition of the created order, but the putting to rights of the Creator's good world. I want to just read you a little bit out of one of N.T. Wright's books. This is N.T. Wright writing as Tom Wright, which is how I read him. I don't read the really difficult stuff. He talks about his own experience. He says, in much of my early Christian life, I was taught, sometimes explicitly and usually by implication, that one should not mix up evangelism and the pursuit of social justice. The former worked in a vertical dimension, the relationship between God and humans, the latter in the horizontal, the relationship between humans have with one another. In addition, I learned it was easy to show that when the churches had concentrated on the latter, they had stopped emphasizing the former. Since evangelism has to do with the eternal state of human beings, and social justice only to do with their temporary existence in this world, it should be clear where the priorities ought to lie. There's no point in oiling the engine of a car that is about to plunge over a cliff. I remember quite vividly living with this mindset, and on one occasion taking the chair at a seminar in which the speaker was a theologian and also a politician. And he was expounding a holistic view of evangelism and social justice. I simply could not understand how he was putting the two together. More disconcerting still, when I asked him how he was doing it, he did not understand my question. For him, the two things were part of the same whole. For me, they belonged in completely different worlds. And that thing began to change my mind. He was working at the time with the letter of Colossians, and he says, as I wrestled with the great poem in the first chapter of Colossians, I found a view of Christ as the Lord of all the powers that ever existed. And he talks about, he says, the upshot of this was, by the time I'd finished with Colossians, or rather, by the time Colossians had finished with me, I not only understood where the seminar speaker was coming from, I now had difficulty in understanding how I'd ever failed to see the point myself, which is why I've put these words from Colossians up here again, and this is from a different book by Tom Wright, that the same God is the Creator God and the Redeemer God, and this seamless motion, if you like, from understanding salvation and redemption to social justice and the nature of the world. So he's emphasizing the fact that all things were created by Jesus in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So this dualism that we sometimes live with between our planet and our faith is not one that we see taught in the writings of Paul. So this leads us to an understanding that salvation is not purely individualistic, but it affects the whole of creation. So my take-home message is this: the incarnation and the death and the resurrection of Jesus have a cosmic significance, not just an individual one. Now, here's an area that we could explore that I'm just going to drop in. We, as the church, are the agents of the new creation. We could add that we are the agents of change in our society, or an important agent for change in our society. And therefore, potentially, if there are forces of anthropogenic origin, things that we've created which are destroying our planet, then as Christians, it is our role. And it's not an add-on, it's a fundamental part of our role, because everything we do is integrated in one purpose. As Christians, we need to work against them. So why should we care about climate change? Firstly, the science is right. I don't think there is any place left for climate deniers. Corrective action is urgently needed. There is a moral imperative, because there are forces at work which are seeking to subvert political change where the climate agenda is concerned, and because for Christians there is a theological imperative. Thanks for your time.
Well, thank you, Hugh, for laying that out very clearly. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, and Linda's going to come around with the microphone. to anyone who would like to kick off. Yes.
It's a bit of a silly question, really, but where is the temperature taken? You know, what?
Okay.
Because I know that
On the
our
top of the
country has gone hot and cold more than
Yeah.
1.5 degrees in the last year or
Yeah.
so.
So
where is that temperature taken?
the measurement is on the top of a volcano in Hawaii, which is not erupting. Sorry, we have a climate scientist in the audience.
The temperature you showed of the increase in temperature through the 20th century, that's a global estimate of temperature, which we can do well back into about the 1850s. And before that, we're relying on things like tree rings and on other measurements. It's a global measurement.
Yeah.
The measurement of carbon dioxide is taken on top of the volcano in Hawaii. That's a standard measurement of CO2. Yeah. Yeah. One of the difficulties is climate and weather. What you're talking about is weather, which will vary every day. Climate is about long-term trends and averages. This is a long-term trend and average.
Thank you, Dave, who will be speaking tomorrow. He used to work for the Met Office. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Extra bit of data.
There's a question there.
Well, first a brief comment and then a question. The brief comment was spurred by your thoughts, which you mentioned stewardship and then what really motivates people, and it made me think of a good book which combines those two things, which is called Stewards of God's Delight, Becoming Priests of the New Creation. And it allies all of these kind of themes around what our duty is, and then also how that's tied to our natural enjoyment of the created world. And there's a sort of similar effort around that called Convivium, which is at Brecon Cathedral in Wales, headed up by Mark Clavier, who's a residentiary canon there. The question kind of comes from the first event I attended there, where there were a lot of like very excitable sort of, Christians interested in climate change and sort of dealing with it and sustainable living. And then there were a number of others there who were Buddhists or atheists or sort of, very religious background. And they came with a different question, which wasn't how do we address it now, but how do we live if this doesn't work? And like, how do you find a way to flourish humanly in a world where we don't succeed and in fact we sort of fail catastrophically? And I don't know if that's a fun topic, but I felt like I should ask it.
I think there's a question just at the end of the same row. Is that?
So let me just stay with that one for a minute. It is a hugely interesting topic. My instant response, but this is the sort of thing we could talk about later on at more length, is that it will affect us as a globe disproportionately. We in our Western culture will probably find a way of surviving, but there will be a lot of people in poorer parts of the world who will just not survive as a consequence. And so there will be an increasing disparity between the rich West and other parts of the world. Is my instant response. So it's not a comfortable answer, that. Sorry, there was another question.
Yeah, sorry. I think there was another question at the end of the row. Do you still have a... No? Okay. Yes, Dave.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I like your theology. I think one of the problems with climate change is convincing people it's relevant, because the timescales involved, 2030, 2040, compared to most things in our lives, that's a long way off. I think there's another motivation for doing something about it, and that actually stems from love. Loving what God loves. God values creation. And actually loving neighbour. Because some of our neighbours are already suffering. That is a much more short-term motivation than these rapid but apparently slow changes are happening. And I think that goes back to the two greatest commandments. That's another way you could draw your response theology to it in a practical way.
Thank you.
No, down here at the front, yes.
Hugh, that was great. Thank you very much. And really important. You won't be surprised if I just want to remind sisters and brothers that, of course, Grosser Test did get there first. One of the more remarkable bits of his theology, and I'm having heard about his science. I now spent the railway journey here getting into some really heavyweight stuff on his theology. He propounded an idea which didn't take as a topic of discussion because it was too revolutionary. But if humankind had not sinned, would our Lord still have become incarnate? All right. Or was the sole purpose of the incarnation to rescue humanity from sin as classically understood? And he mounts a very strong argument based on his understanding of natural philosophy and his belief that all the things you were saying about God's attitude towards the world, that God would anyway have wanted to come into the world to celebrate, to seal, to reorder, to justify the natural order of things.
Yes.
And I think that it's interesting to see that the scholastics of the 14th century who followed Grosseteste had some difficulty thinking that, well, why are we talking about that? We all know why Jesus came. You can never resolve the question anyway.
Yes.
And I think I'll be really interested to find out what reaction in today's world is towards a similar. You're not proposing quite this. You're not coming at it from the same angle, but in a way, the question that's being raised is the same.
Yeah.
Is God's essential, primary, and overwhelming concern with our individual souls, or is God seeking the restoration and reordering of the whole cosmos which he loves? And obviously I'd go to God so loved the world that he came.
Can I just bounce that back with a question to you? In medieval society, were people as individualistic as we are today in their thinking? And so would they have responded as we might respond today? We talk about a very individualistic form of salvation, and therefore we think of the necessity of, if you like, in traditional language, of Jesus coming for me, and we're talking about it differently now. But would people in medieval times have thought of things in the same way?
In terms of individual salvation, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And so going to one of these late medieval 15th century churches which still survive in great numbers, there are plenty of places where you see individual people going and praying in front of an individual saint or whatever it is, or setting up memorials to them or their family. So that concern for individual salvation and a sense of individual memorialization as well is clear.
Yeah.
What I think was different was that at a local level anywhere, and it tended to be very local, people were more in it together than we are. They were more highly dependent on each other. They were living more communally, and they understood, and perhaps were sometimes found rather claustrophobic, a social order which told them exactly how they fitted. And that's, I think, where the individualism now bites and makes it different. That our default position is that I'm standing on the edge looking into the world, and I can be what I like and do what I like. Whereas their position is standing in the middle of the world, and I'm a peasant, or I'm a farmer, or I'm a knight, and I know really what I should be doing.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I know there isn't time for you to tell us how to solve the whole thing. Okay, you said that earlier on, but this comes a little bit on the last question. So my daughter is 19, and she has become a vegan because of this whole thing, along with quite a few of her friends. And I definitely support that, and I'm working in that direction. But I think this argument about what does an individual do is a bit of a problem, because yes, individually we could do something like that, or and insulate our homes and so on. But actually, A, I think that that's obviously not enough, and B, I don't think this focus on individualism is a problem, because it can also, because it's not going to be enough. So why bother? Give up, in other words. So where do you see the opportunities for, say, for churches to get involved in things that will make a difference, that are not just this individualistic approach, if you see what I mean?
Well, my immediate response, and again, this is something that I think we could work through as a group and talk more about, because I don't think my response is been thought through for a long period of time. And incidentally, I am also challenged by my children, who drive electric cars and eat vegan food and so on. But I think that we have to be more political about this. I do think this is a global problem, and it can only be solved through political will. And I think there is a remarkable lack of political will. We've seen these climate conferences now since the 1990s. And I know Europe is doing stuff, and we've got legislation in place that's forcing us to do things. And I think that has to be the way forward. So at a political level, if we can persuade people in power that this really, really matters, they will then make us do things, and that way we will tend to comply. But maybe Debbie doesn't agree.
I think there's a need for both, and I think you're right to point out that the European Union, including Britain, has done a lot politically towards this. But
Yes.
think back, to December in Paris. The French government increased fuel costs with a climate levy. They had rioting on the streets, and they backtracked. So they've got an example of a government trying to do something, and yet individuals saying we can't cope with this. I think ever since the financial crash of 2008, people have, the general feeling is too expensive to do anything about at the moment.
Yeah.
I think actually doing things at individual level is important, as well as politicians doing things. Because politicians actually, in democracies, if enough people make a fuss about something, they will listen.
Yeah.
Because they want to get elected next time. So individual action and choices, I think, are very important, as well as the macro scale stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. And if I might just add, and I think this is why it's an important topic for us today, because as I mentioned, I do believe that churches are a major agent for change. It's what we believe in. We believe that lives can be transformed and changed. And so if we believe that, then surely this has to be part of our mission, which is why I wanted this to be part of the topics for conversation today. But there is much, much more.
Just a comment, really, picking up on previous things. I'm from Lincoln now. Bishop Christopher went out to the Philippines. He was asked by Justin Welby to go out as part of the climate change team a couple of years ago, and we've had a climate change and faith conference in Lincoln for the last 3 years now. And I think that whole thing about connectedness and about love is fundamental. And I think the thing that makes it real is when we understand that it affects another, but we do see that other person as somebody who is really connected to us. Last year, when Bishop Christopher opened the conference, he'd been out to Indonesia, and then he'd stopped off on the way home in Australia, where his first grandchild had been born. So he'd gone to this conference, he'd gone and seen the impact of the sea level rises on these small islands. He'd gone and heard about people losing their livelihoods, people whose homes were being washed away, people who were really struggling to make ends meet because of an impact of climate change. And then he'd hopped across the water a bit and gone and seen the next generation of his family, and he said it absolutely shook him to the core. And for the first time, he realised how real it was, and that it was going to impact somebody that he was intimately connected with. Yeah. And I think there are all sorts of ways that we can do that. I mean, in our family, we've been greenies for quite a long time. But one of the things that we did early on was we we sponsored a young lad out in the Philippines. And we get letters from him. But it makes us very aware whenever we hear anything on the news that's over there. It's not just something that's happening on the other side of the world. It's, oh my goodness, what's happened to John? Because this is a little boy who writes to us every month and is real. He's part of our family and it's real, and we are really concerned about what's going on over there.
Yeah.
And that's how we've got connected. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to get really connected on a level that's powered by love.
Yeah. Thank you.
I actually disagree with people who say, you know, that we can't do something as individuals. We've taken it quite seriously, feeling that part of our God's first commission to us in Genesis was to look after, to be stewards of the earth. And long story, I'm not going into all of it. We've developed an eco house, but the conversations that we have with people mean that we've got friends who've started to think about what they plant in their garden. We've got friends who've put up solar panels in their house. We've got friends who are just thinking about what they can do to help the environment. And so just because our tiny drop in the ocean, if each of us put a drop of water in a cup now, would have quite a bit of water in the bottom of that cup by the time we'd finished. And just those individual actions and impacts, I think, are quite important as far as the climate's concerned.
Yeah. Thank you.
A couple of things it might be worth us noting is that if we are able to leave some of our denominational prejudices behind, the Pope did produce a rather good document called Laudato Si, which tackles this issue and very much addresses the issue of what it means for the poor. And incorporated within those ideas is the notion that Creation Tide should be celebrated throughout September and up to the 4th of October, which is St. Francis Day, which gives an opportunity to focus on some international perspectives as well.
Yeah. If I can just add one thing, I mean, I agree totally that what we do as individuals really matters, because in aggregate it actually amounts to a lot. But just coming back to the sort of governmental and corporate side of things, I mean, the ultimate bad boy in this business is carbon-based fuels. So it's burning oil and gas and coal. And ultimately we have to stop doing that. And there are people who don't like that. And there's the whole motor industry that, of course, is dependent on those fuels, and our house heating and so on. There's a lot at stake there. But a move to divest from those companies, so this is financial now, a financial argument is one that is very powerful. And I've been reading I started by talking about a book by Jeremy Leggett, and I've been reading another one of his recently. And he makes a very interesting argument. It's a little bit intricate, but it's basically the big oil companies are valued on the basis of their assets. And their assets are reserves in the ground that are not yet drilled, or they're drilled but they're not yet pumped. And so if you look to 2050, 2060, they have all these assets on their balance sheet which are worth billions, if not trillions of dollars. And yet they're never going to realize those assets because the world will change. So these companies are overvalued. And then if you've got pension funds paying into the shares of these companies, this fund is going to crash. And so he's basically saying there's this carbon bubble which will, in years to come, crash. Now, he was writing this in about 2015, 2016, so it's not come about as he would predict. But there is a financial argument for saying we need to be very, very careful with investment in the carbon-based industry. They have great lobbying power, but ultimately we need to watch the way they work and behave. And as we divest from them, then we can see their power diminishing, and then there is a greater political will to change the order of things in which our society works at the moment. So that's just another angle. I'm sorry, that's provoked another question maybe.
No, Rodney's been waiting for a
Oh,
long
sorry.
time, very patiently,
Yeah.
so I'll let
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said and so on. We need to reduce our dependence on the fossil fuels. We need to do what we can as individuals. I think that all adds up. Eat less, put solar panels on the roof, use electric cars, and so on. Absolutely right. But is there anything? Are there any kind of technological fixes that will help? Is there anything you can do? I don't know. See clouds that reflect more of the sunlight back or something. I don't know. But do you?
Yes, there is. And this brings me back to my geological background. There's a thing called carbon capture and storage, which is basically pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, maybe liquefying it, pumping it back into the oil wells from which it came, is one option, or reacting it with certain rock types to stabilize it. I mean, there's been carbon dioxide. I didn't mention this, it's another talk, but originally our planet had a carbon dioxide atmosphere. There was no oxygen, there was no nitrogen, it was just carbon dioxide. And where is that today? It must be locked up in the rocks. Limestone is a good example. So there are ways of locking up carbon dioxide. And if you're talking about 100 million year timescale, this happens naturally. But we're not, we're talking about tens and hundreds of years. So it has to happen unnaturally. So there is a technology. It is tested, but it is not deployed widely at the moment. And there may be cheaper technologies that I'm not privy to, but that's one I do know about.
So, one last question.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment on something following on from that.
Yes.
A friend of mine is involved in the political side of climate change, and he was talking to me about these ideas of spraying things into the atmosphere to try to create the equivalent of a volcanic eruption and so on.
Yeah.
And his view is, I mean, I know there are lots of views about that, but one danger about that is that the countries that are very interested in that tend to be the richer countries, and it's perhaps seen as a sort of quick fix. Nobody really knows what the effects will be on it, and actually many of the poorer countries are not happy with that as a prospect. Anyway, that's just a sort of side issue.
Well, they would be sulfur gases, and they have the potential to react and produce acids and do all sorts of things that we don't really know at the moment. That would be the volcanic analogue. So
Very pained expression on our meteorologist's face while this is going on. So I think it's interesting. But thank you very much, Hugh, for introducing all these ideas. I think there's a lot to explore and act on here. So.